Good afternoon, everyone. My comments today, I teach American religious history at Eden Seminary in St. Louis. So my comments today will primarily relate to sort of relationship of history, communication and change, and thinking about new media. Someone mentioned earlier, Tony Lee mentioned earlier, and someone else had asked me over lunch, the current project that I'm working on is called Preaching on Wax, and hopefully it'll be out at the end of this year, fingers crossed. And it chronicles the period from 1920 to 1945 with primarily Protestant preachers getting record contracts from major labels, Columbia, Victor, which was later RCA, to record and sell their sermons. So that kind of gives you an idea of how I kind of come about thinking about new media. So I primarily, what I'll do today is I have basically 4 stories, brief historical stories that I'll kind of tie in together to sort of make broader points about the use of new media. And because, like Brother Tony, I'm not a preacher, but I was raised in a Baptist church, so my points do have alliteration, so you'll be able to sort of maybe remember them. And ironically, they all start with P's, so apparently it's some type of connection here. And I promise I wrote this before you gave your talk. I'm not coming on your heels. The minister was cutting edge in his communication skills, ministry, and creative use of media. His ingenuity gained him much awe. His media works, including chronicles, reflections, and sermon collections, garnered much attention and unprecedented traffic and market attention. His novel communication created large revival meetings with countless followers experiencing the divine in new and strange ways outside of the purview of the church and clerical authorities. His name, likeness, and ministerial activities and schedule appeared in countless popular media outlets. His utilization of new media enabled him to escape the established norms of Christian ministry and theology. Moreover, employing new media made his message and influence seemingly boundless. Supporters welcomed and christened the new methods, convinced that he represented a new and exciting form and practice of church work with obvious results. Nevertheless, despite his popularity and innovative use of media, or rather perhaps because of it, numerous detractors regarded his mass communications and media ministry inappropriate at best, and at worst sacrilegious and perhaps downright heretical. The preacher's new methods were criticized on several grounds. Many intellectuals ignored him, while others publicly disavowed him and his ministry. Members of the Harvard faculty and the president declared that he lacked the substantive skills to help persons truly understand the religious life. Moreover, they dubbed his ministry as a detriment to religion, dangerous, and utterly inconsistent with the gospel and the very essence of church work. Similarly, a group of clergy issued a dismissive statement describing his ministry as shallow, claiming that he relied on craft and cunning to strike the passions and engage the affections of the people. The preacher, according to his opponents, was running afoul of religious tradition. The year 1744. The preacher, Reverend George Whitefield. His creative use of communication and print media were poised to significantly alter the nascent religious landscape of America, namely the nature of religious experience, religious gatherings, and parishioners' expectations and perceptions of clerical authority. This long view of religion and media reveals that the introduction of new media into America has consistently caused considerable debate and changes in American culture and religion, particularly Protestant Christianity. This dynamic is apparent throughout the evolution of popular media technology, ranging from the creative religious uses of print, the phonograph, radio, television, internet, and now social media. Each stage of the development of mass communications has challenged established norms, traditions, and practices of American culture and religion. Such changes have continually had profound religious and theological ramifications. This is not to say that history repeats itself. However, it is to say that new media has historically provided not just new methods and means to communicate the gospel, but also new norms of practicing and proclaiming Christianity, ways of being religious, as well as new norms and new forms of church. To this end, with an eye toward history, I want to briefly examine 3 salient interrelated ways new media is altering the cultural and religious landscape of America. I want to classify these with 3 P's: proclamation, practice, and power. I believe pondering the aforementioned will prove fruitful in our efforts to understand the intersections of theology, religion, and new media. Now, the second story, and this deals with proclamation. At least since the words, "What hath God wrought," officially opened up America's long-range electronic telegraph wire in 1844, religious adherents have interpreted the advancement of electronic communication technology as a godsend. In excitement and religious anticipation, Reverend Gardner Spring praised the new telegraph wire as bringing Christianity to the, quote, border of a spiritual harvest, because thought now travels by steam, railroad, and by magnetic wires, unquote. This preacher believed that the emergence of new communication technologies would only enhance and further Christianity in America and beyond. Now, this popular perception of media as a tool of divine purpose, coupled with the progression of communication technology, has contributed to each generation of Americans growing increasingly accustomed to engaging in religious practices via electronic mediums. This progression has had several ramifications. Perhaps the most distinctive is that religious proclamation and explanation increasingly occur through the parameters and confines of social media. Mediums are a part of the message now. For example, there are over 500,000 apps available for Apple, Android, and BlackBerry phones and tablets. Many of these apps are altering how the faithful engage God. Religion apps offer full versions of holy text for easily searchable references, themed devotional reminders, prayer apps that allow the faithful to send prayers to others as well as across the world, and finally, the ability to make virtual offerings to deities. It behooves the observer of new media and religion and the practitioner, then, to ponder how the abbreviated parameters, time and space limitations of certain media shape the very content and thus the theology of our religious messages. What does the shortening of expression mean for religious leaders and communities that are bound together by narratives in the power of story that are longer than 140 characters? What does it mean to say that as people of the book, are we cultivating a tweeted or soundbite religion as opposed to one of narrative and story? In other words, can Christians actually make sense and understand Moses' 10 tweets without cultivating an engagement with the longer narrative of the actual Exodus story? Are the red highlighted tweets of Jesus properly understood apart from developing an understanding of the longer narrative of Jesus' life on the margins? To be sure, these abbreviated forms of scripture and religious faith can be useful. Tracts, commercials, tweets, New Testament Bibles only. Such tools are geared, it seems to be, that maybe such tools are geared and suited more towards evangelism or outreach, and maybe not the development of robust spiritual formation. Simply put, then, to engage in social media, then, religious persons, observers, and practitioners must be attentive to how such mediums, how the parameters of these mediums, promote and limit our messages and content and theology and orientation and even our projected aims. Second story relates to practice. On January 2nd, 1921, Reverend Edwin J. Van Etten, the rector of Calvary Episcopal Church in Pittsburgh, he gained the distinction of leading the first live worship radio broadcast in American history. The preacher had low expectations of the historical moment. He confessed, quote, "I thought there would be some fluke in the connection and that the whole thing would just be a fizzle." In fact, he was so concerned about distracting his worshipers that the radio equipment personnel were dressed in choir robes. It was two Jewish brothers who were dressed in choir robes and put in the choir loft holding the equipment. And this is what the rector wanted for fear that it would distract the worshipers. This is 1921. Now, to his surprise, Van Etten received a letter from a listener from over 400 miles away in Massachusetts. This was a significant distance in 1921. The distant parishioner praised the religious use of new media because, quote, for the first time in 20 years, I had the opportunity to hear a full worship service, she said. She enthusiastically told the religious media pioneer that, quote, the voice of the pastor thrilled me as few things have in life, unquote. At the conclusion of the media service, the long-distance religious practitioner summed up her religious experience by writing to the pastor and saying, quote, I felt peace with the world, peace that passes all understanding. Together, her and Reverend Van Etten and this remote parishioner helped to reshape the practice of congregation and church. Throughout the 20th century, the faithful have increasingly utilized electronic mediums to engage in religious experience outside the formal and physical gatherings of churches and congregations. Subsequently, electronic religious mediums shape our conceptions and theological categories of what actually constitutes the religious practice of gathering and congregation and community. Like Reverend Van Etten almost a century ago, mass mediums of communication are connecting otherwise disparate communities and therefore are creating new forms and practices of gathering in church and community. Now, public commentary on such religious media often reflects a deep concern for the actual loss of community in terms of physical gathering. Many observers feel that the virtual communities, such as online congregations and religious groups, might become proxies for actual physical interactions and gatherings. However, social media, I'd like to say, can be utilized not as the primary mechanism, perhaps, of community, but rather as a supplement to the formation of community. This supplemental role is particularly true among large religious institutions such as megachurches and Christian schools, even as large religious gatherings are becoming more and more concentrated in American religion. But social media can promote and perhaps facilitate the convening of smaller groups and Bible studies, house churches, for example. Such assemblies provide for a sense of community that is not always apparent in large faith communities. So Darkwood Brew, for example, that we've talked a little bit about today, they provide a sense of community through their online television program. The Young Clergy Women's Project creates an online community of support for female clerics across the country. New forms of community are also being carved out in religious educational institutions as well. Now, the case study that I did, which was we were not able to have a respondent here, was from Abilene Christian University, where they have a mobile learning initiative where every student gets a brand new iPhone when they come on the campus, and the school has an app that everything a student would possibly need is in the app. Documents, lecture notes, they use their iPhone to check in attendance into the classroom. Everything is there on the app. Now, when I went there, I talked to the students about this concern about community, and the students there found that the use of social media had positively influenced the formation of communal interaction. Students who matriculated during the advent of this mobile learning initiative reported an increase in group study sessions and group gatherings. Moreover, from 2000 to 2011, 86% of the students at Abilene reported improved student-to-student and student-to-teacher collaborations and interactions because of social media. This mobile technology and the multitude of social networks allow the students to connect with those whom they might never physically engage in conversation. Seemingly, the ubiquitous nature of social media is not a complete proxy for physical gathering and contact. But these virtual connections, like today, several people have said, hey, we've tweeted. It's nice to actually meet you, right? So in the same sense, the social media at Abilene and other faith communities can help to facilitate these kind of connections. Now, the last story is about power, and I'll be done. In the early days of religious radio, there were several attempts to limit new media access to only a select few. In 1927, the Advisory Council of the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, appointed a committee on religious activities to draft a course of action that would, quote, satisfy the deep-seated interest of listeners on radio to religion. The committee drafted a five-fold statement regarding the contours of NBC's religious broadcasting policy. The policy which NBC adopted restricted religious broadcasting to, quote, only the recognized outstanding leaders of the Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish faiths. These folks, including Harry Emerson Fosdick, who is, of course, known around these parts, these folks received free sustaining broadcasting time on NBC, free time. All other groups, including evangelical groups such as Charles Fuller, Amy Semple McPherson, and others who wanted to broadcast, had to pay commercial time to broadcast. Now, on a side note, many would say that this sort of connects to why evangelical groups, as we talked about earlier, seem to do a better job of raising money and getting on great time spots. Some of it's historically conditioned, because the free time that mainline churches were getting was primarily when the radio networks wanted to give away free time when no one was listening, in the evening or at night. Groups who were willing to pay, Charles Fuller and others who had the money to pay, could get on prime time radio time when everyone was listening. So some of that can relate to historically conditioning why certain groups tend to be better at raising funds and getting online, historically speaking. Getting on primetime media markets, historically speaking. But for the purposes of our time today about power, this relates to about how new media is changing the way we think about power and authority, essentially who gets to be at the mic and when, right? So new media has historically has democratizing effect upon authority and intellectually gatekeeping ideas. As with this development of radio in the 1920s and 1930s, the contemporary progression of social media has altered national and mass public discourse in that recognized experts, leaders, and common persons alike all have access to large platforms of proclamation, information, and power. Twitter, Facebook, and mobile text offer countless individuals power and forms of authority and seemingly autonomy over the reception and production of messages and information. Similarly, clerical and theological authorities do not hold complete influence and authority over religious social media. The democratizing effect and the democratizing platforms of new media allow for religious parishioners and seekers to create, contribute, and consume a variety of religious experiences and proclamations. To be sure, since the colonial days of Anne Hutchinson and others, Christians in America have authored and shared their own religious proclamations and theologies outside the jurisdiction of clerical authorities, oftentimes at the risk and actuality of marginalization, oppression, or even death. However, social media has made the production and spread of such autonomous religious expressions and experience more abundant, easily accessible, popular, and commonplace. Such prevalence has altered the expectations of the role played by clerical and theological authorities, namely the power and authority and role of such figures play in religious formation and religious life. And briefly, I'll just say at ACU, for example, at Abilene, students were reporting that they no longer expected their professors to be the sole authority in the room anymore. They had their iPhones that could simply be checking and Wikipediaing and Googling what their professor was saying in the class. So they often thought of their professor as simply a guide to new knowledge and not as a sole authority of new knowledge. And I think in some ways it's the same way, right, we could say with new media and clerical authority, that sometimes now clerics maybe now are seen more as spiritual guides and not as like the Bible answer man anymore, if that makes any sense. So examining how new media is shifting America's cultural landscape is key to understanding the theological changes in America. Religious practitioners increasingly hear, experience, and cultivate their religious lives throughout social media. Understanding these said changes requires more than just social media acumen. It's not just about how to tweet and how to be on Facebook, but it also requires and necessitates a long view concerning how mediums have historically influenced the theological meanings and formulations of religious proclamations, practices, and authority. Now, the mediums and devices, to be sure, are not the same, but the potential shifts to religious proclamation, practice, and power have historical precedents that necessitate not only our attention, but hopefully will inform and condition our current practices today. Thank you.